There is a number you need to hear first. 2,000. That is roughly how many Filipino residents live in the entire city of Cincinnati. Not the state, not the region, just the city itself. 2,000 people is smaller than the student body of a single large high school. It would not even come close to filling the smallest stadium at the tennis complex hosting this week's tournament. Now here is the part that does not make sense. In just a few days, people are expecting a stadium built for more than 11,000 fans to be packed, full of Filipino flags, full of noise, loud enough to surround a two-time Grand Slam finalist before she even hits her first serve. So how does that work? How does a community of 2,000 people fill a building with a capacity more than 5 times its own size? Where do the other 9,000 people even come from? Or the other 15,000 if the number floating around online is actually real? If you are Filipino or Filipino-American, some part of you probably already knows the shape of this answer. You have watched this exact scene happen in city after city, and at this point it barely surprises you. But stay with me anyway, because by the end of this video, you are going to know exactly where the number 17,000 actually comes from and why counting how many Filipinos live inside one city limit was never the right way to measure any of this. I am not going to explain that yet. Right now, I just want you sitting with the contradiction. 2,000 people counted in the census, a stadium expecting to overflow. Something in that gap does not add up, and closing that gap is the entire point of the next 20 minutes. But before we get anywhere near where 17,000 comes from, you need to understand something else first. Why does a tennis match in a mid-sized city in Ohio matter enough to pull a crowd like this together at all? Because once you understand that part, every number that follows is going to hit completely differently. Her name is Alex Eala, and if you have not heard it yet, you are about to hear it a lot. She is 21 years old. Just a few weeks ago, she won the biggest title of her career, her first ever WTA Tour level singles championship in Washington, D.C. Nobody from the Philippines had ever done that before. Not once in the entire history of the sport. Right now, she is sitting at a career-high ranking, number 20 in the world, and she walked into this tournament in Cincinnati seeded 17th, the best seeding she has ever earned at this level. So this is not some feel-good underdog story about a player nobody has heard of. This is a legitimate rising star, on one of the best runs of her career, walking into one of the biggest tournaments on the entire calendar. And here is the thing about crowds like the one expected in Cincinnati. This is not the first time it has happened. It is barely even unusual anymore. Just days before arriving in Ohio, Eala played in Toronto. The stadium there, SoBay's Stadium, holds 12,500 people. It was packed, flags everywhere. And that crowd actually makes complete sense once you know the numbers behind it, because the Greater Toronto area is home to more than 270,000 people of Filipino descent. That is one of the largest Filipino communities anywhere outside the Philippines itself. A packed stadium in a city with 270,000 potential fans nearby is not a mystery. That is just math working the way you would expect it to, which is exactly why Cincinnati breaks the pattern. Cincinnati does not have anything close to that population. It is not even in the same conversation, and yet the exact same scene, flags, noise, a stadium bracing for overflow, is expected to repeat itself in a city that on paper should not be able to produce it. Here is why that gap actually matters, and why it is worth pausing on instead of scrolling past. If crowd size in Toronto can be fully explained by population, but crowd size in Cincinnati cannot, then something else has to be generating that energy. Something that has nothing to do with how many people technically live inside the city limits. And once you start pulling on that thread, the story stops being about one tennis match and starts being about how loyalty like this actually spreads. That is the real question sitting underneath this whole video, and I promise you the answer is more interesting than the number 17,000 by itself. If a story like that is the kind of thing you like digging into, stick around, because this channel exists for exactly this. The moments where a stat looks impossible until you actually take it apart piece by piece, because Toronto proved the normal rule. Big population, big crowd, no surprise there. But Cincinnati is about to break that rule completely, and the three examples coming up are going to make that gap even harder to explain. Let's start with Toronto again, because it holds the first real clue. 12,500 people packed into Sobeys Stadium. Eala herself posted about it afterward, saying the feeling of being out on that court, surrounded by that much support, was something words could barely capture. That is not a small reaction. That is a player who has played in front of a lot of crowds telling you this one hit differently, and then she lost. Round of 16, straight sets, all that noise, all that energy, and it did not translate into a win. So, here is the first question worth sitting with. If 270,000 potential fans in the stands could not carry her to victory, what is that crowd actually doing for her? Because clearly, it is not deciding the scoreboard. Now let's go to the number that is supposed to explain Cincinnati. The city itself has roughly 2,000 Filipino residents. But zoom out to the entire state of Ohio, and that number jumps to nearly 17,000, almost 9 times larger. Which means the people expected to fill that stadium are not primarily driving in from Cincinnati at all. They are coming from Columbus, from Dayton, from Cleveland. People crossing hours of highway, from cities that have nothing to do with where this tournament happens to be held. So here is the second question, and this one is sharper than the first. If measuring Eala's support by the population of one single city was wrong for Cincinnati, then every number we have been using this entire time might be measuring the wrong thing entirely. Sit with that for a second, because it changes how you should be reading this whole story. Now here is the third piece, and it does not come from a spreadsheet or a census report. It comes straight from Eala herself. She has talked openly about her schedule getting busier, not with practice, but with commitments to fans and media. And she describes that as a sign she is becoming something bigger on tour. That is not speculation from a journalist trying to build a narrative. That is the player, in her own words, confirming that something about her support system has fundamentally shifted. 3 pieces, 3 clues, and none of them fully close the gap on their own. Toronto shows us a crowd that shows up, but does not guarantee a win. Ohio shows us that the real number is nearly 9 times bigger than the city alone, but still might not capture the full picture. And Eala's own words confirm, this is not random. It is a growing pattern she can feel happening in real time. So where does that leave us? 9 times bigger sounds like it should be the answer. 17,000 instead of 2,000? Problem solved, right? Except it is not that simple. Because if you actually think about what that 17,000 number represents, it still assumes people only show up if they already live somewhere nearby. It still assumes fandom follows the same rules as a census count. And every single piece of evidence you just heard is quietly pointing toward the exact same uncomfortable conclusion. That assumption might be wrong, completely wrong. And if it is, then the real number behind this stadium was never really about population at all. Here is where you need to throw out the assumption you have probably been making this entire video without even realizing it. The instinct is to think crowd size equals local population. More people living nearby, bigger crowd at the game. That is how it works for almost every sports team on Earth. A hometown team draws from its hometown. Simple. Obvious. Except Eala does not have a hometown team in the United States. She does not have one single city that functions as her home base here. So if crowd size always followed local population, none of what you just watched in Toronto or what is about to happen in Cincinnati should even be possible. Which means the whole premise everyone keeps repeating. The idea that you can measure her support by counting who lives inside a city limit was broken from the very first sentence of this video. Think about how touring musicians actually work for a second. A band does not have a hometown audience in every city on their tour. They might play in a town where almost none of their biggest fans technically live. And the arena still sells out. because fans do not wait for the show to come exactly to their neighborhood. They get in the car. They drive 2 hours, 4 hours, sometimes across state lines, just to be in the room for one specific night. If you map out where those ticket buyers actually live, it looks nothing like a map of the city hosting the concert. That is exactly what is happening here. The number 17,000, the population of Filipino Americans across the entire state of Ohio, was never supposed to be some kind of ceiling. It is closer to a floor, a baseline, because it only counts people who happen to already live within the state. And it says nothing about fans crossing in from Kentucky or Indiana, or the ones who will drive 5, 6, 7 hours. Specifically, because this match is happening now and might not happen again for years. 2,000 people in Cincinnati was never the real number. It was never even close to being the real number. The real question was always how many people are willing to travel for this, not how many people happen to already live nearby. And once you see it that way, that one sentence you have probably heard 100 times, that a community this small could never fill a stadium this big, stops making any sense at all, because it was built on a rule that simply does not apply here. If that reframe just clicked for you the way it clicked for me while putting this together, I want to know something. Do you think 17,000 undersells what is actually coming? Or do you think it is still the ceiling, and Cincinnati is about to prove everyone wrong in the other direction? Drop your guess in the comments, because I am genuinely curious which side most of you land on before we get to the actual proof. Because this reframe cannot just live on a theory, it needs receipts. And it turns out, the exact pattern you just heard about has already happened, more than once, in ways that leave almost no room for doubt. Let's go back to Toronto one more time, because there is a detail in that story that matters more than the loss itself. 12,500 people did not show up because Eala was guaranteed to win. They showed up anyway. Win or lose, the stadium filled. That tells you something important. This crowd was never really about the scoreline. It was about being there together for a player who represents something bigger than one match. That is not a one-time reaction. That is a pattern repeating itself, city after city, regardless of outcome. Now look at Washington, D.C. This is where Eala won her first ever tour-level title. The first one by any player from the Philippines in the history of the sport. And the response to that win did not stay inside the tennis world. The president of the Philippines personally hosted a reception to celebrate her. Think about what that actually means. This is not a local fan club organizing a watch party. This is national recognition, at the highest level of government, for a tennis match played thousands of miles away from home. That is not the kind of support that respects state lines or population counts. That is loyalty, operating on a completely different scale. And then there is Eala's own description of what this all feels like from the inside. She has said that standing in a stadium full of that much love is something she carries with her long after the match ends. She has also said her schedule keeps getting busier, not because of tournaments, but because of the growing list of people who want a piece of her time. Those are not throwaway comments. Those are direct confirmations from the one person actually living this, that something bigger than a local fan base has been building around her. Put those three pieces together, and the picture becomes obvious. Toronto shows the crowd shows up regardless of the result. Washington shows the support reaches the highest levels of an entire country. And Eala's own words confirm this did not happen by accident. She can feel it accelerating in real time. So go back to that number sitting at the start of this video. 2,000. It was never wrong exactly. It was just answering a question nobody should have been asking. It counted who lives in Cincinnati. It never had any chance of counting who was willing to travel to Cincinnati. And here is the detail that makes this even more concrete. The match against Anisimova is being played on center court, the biggest stage at this entire tournament, with a capacity of roughly 11,600 seats. You do not need all 17,000 people in Ohio to show up for that number to work. You barely need a third of them, once you add in everyone crossing state lines the same way they did in Toronto and Washington. Suddenly, a sold-out center court does not look impossible at all. It looks almost inevitable, which means the question this video opened with finally has an answer sitting right in front of you. So here it is, the answer to the number that started this whole video. 2000 was never wrong. It just measured the wrong thing. It counted people who live inside Cincinnati. It never had any way of counting the people who were coming for Cincinnati, specifically because of one name on a scoreboard. The real army was never defined by a zip code. It is defined by how far someone is willing to travel for a player they consider theirs. And that support is not some side detail in this story. It is the exact thing that turned a teenager ranked outside the top 600 in the world into a tour champion now walking onto center court against a two-time Grand Slam finalist. None of that happens without people showing up, city after city, regardless of the scoreline, regardless of the distance. So here is where it leaves us. Monday, we find out if center court actually fills the way everyone expects. We find out if the number 17,000 turns out to be exactly right, or if it turns out to be way too small, the same way 2000 was. Either way, the bigger story already happened before a single ball gets hit. A community too small on paper to matter is about to prove that paper was never the right way to measure it in the first place. So tell me what you think is actually going to happen. Do you think that stadium fills all the way up? Do you think this crowd shows up the same way it did in Toronto and Washington, no matter what the scoreboard ends up saying? I want to know your prediction before Monday happens, not after. And if you want to see how this actually plays out, the follow-up goes up the moment the match ends. Subscribing is really just the difference between catching that answer right away or finding it days later, buried under everything else that gets posted that week. Because 2000 was never the real number, Monday is going to show all of us what the real one actually looks like.